If you're even remotely human, you've likely asked yourself these questions.
Who am I? And why do I exist? And who made me? And what am I expected to do with my life?
And if you have, the good news is you're not alone, because these are the very questions explored by existential thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Søren Kierkegaard, and many others over the past 2 centuries. So what is this ambiguous, multifaceted, ideological movement that we call existentialism? And where do you start? Well, today I'm going to broadly explain this loosely defined philosophical movement, as well as share 7 book recommendations for where you could start. First off, trying to define or pinpoint existentialism is a quite convoluted and difficult endeavor, primarily because a lot of the thinkers that we associate with the movement either repudiated the term or have contradicting ideas compared to others within this group that we call existentialism. So I like to think of it as an umbrella term, or as my friend Gage Greer over at Turtleneck Philosophy describes it, as a mood, or kind of like a mode of thinking. But with that said, there are still some general themes, principles, and currents, if you will, that allow us to categorize this previously ill-defined school of thought. The first of which being existential dread and anxiety. Simply put, this is the moment once you acknowledge your own mortality and you get that just anxious, gross, uncomfortable feeling in your gut because you know that your death is imminent, there's no escaping it, and you start to question your own existence. Is there an afterlife? If there's no afterlife, am I just into a void for eternity? And so this dread comes over you like a storm cloud you can't get out of, and that usually leads people to nihilism. But instead of falling into that nihilistic, pessimistic worldview, existentialists turn towards a different route, which leads me to the next principle, which is self-defined purpose. And a lot of this comes out of Jean-Paul Sartre's work, where he explicitly states existence precedes essence. And what he means by that is that our identity, our meaning, our direction in life is not predetermined. We have this opportunity and this ability to direct ourselves, to change our path, to create our own essence and identity. We're not damned to live a certain existence, but that we can enact our will, create our own meaning and value in this world. Third is embracing the present moment and life itself. Essentially, what existentialists try to do is not look towards some afterlife, not look towards some future heaven where we can be happy, or some nirvana that we're working towards, but being grateful for what we have and kind of accepting the fact that for all we know, this is all we have. All we have is one life. So we should be grateful for this present moment, make the most of it, and as Camus says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And lastly, freedom and self-responsibility. A lot of this builds upon what I spoke about earlier about existence preceding essence, and it's this idea that we can change our lives through our choices, our actions, our beliefs, that we actually have a bit of autonomy and control over how our life goes, the direction it goes, that as much as there are uncontrollables in our lives, there's different demands and pressures that come upon us, that we still have the opportunity to choose how we react to them, to choose where we step, the direction we go. It puts a bit more onus on the individual. So with that brief introduction about what existentialism is and what falls under that umbrella, let's talk about the 7 books I'd recommend you start with. The first book is Existentialism is a Humanism by Jean-Paul Sartre. And this little book is actually a transcript from a lecture he gave in 1945 that went under the same title. Now, the reason why I think you should start with this book rather than some of the other works that we're going to talk about that actually precede this book is because he really is a bit more straightforward and lucid about what exactly existentialism is. It's very easy to kind of understand. It's not so esoteric and confusing and mixed in with all these aphorisms like Nietzsche's work. It's mostly straightforward. And like I said, he states existence precedes essence. And he follows up with this beautiful quote here on page 22. What do we mean here by existence precedes essence? We mean that man first exists. He materializes in the world, encounters himself, and only afterwards defines himself. If man as existentialists conceive of him cannot be defined, it is because to begin with he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. So I don't think I need to add too much more than that, but essentially we are born like a clean slate into this world under the eyes of Sartre. And through our actions, through our choices, through the responsibility and free will that we enact in this world, that's how we materialize, that's how we create meaning and define ourselves. The next is a book that's not discussed too often, although the philosopher himself is quite popular, and that is Two Ages by Søren Kierkegaard. And this is actually a literary review, but through the review, Kierkegaard presents a very valuable exposition on society. Specifically, this idea that the present age, the age that we exist in still to today, is quite passionless, and that the individual has been so-called leveled by society, that originally individuals were grouping together under the shared idea, the shared sentiment. They would come together as a collective, a group, the public, this collective mass, and would be able to be more powerful through being a group. But over time, being in this kind of conglomeration, the individual becomes subsumed by the group, and you start to create groupthink, and you start to create tribalism, and the individual can no longer kind of have this dissension. And essentially, individuality, individual values, self-expression becomes leveled over time by this public, by this kind of group collectivism. Overall, this literary review does a phenomenal job at expressing the value of protecting our individuality, our beliefs, and not allowing ourselves to be consumed by collectivism and ran over by these ideological camps that I think we all have witnessed in the modern day. And also later in this literary review, I like that he also pushes this idea of silence as inwardness. And essentially, what he's getting at is maintaining the value of practices such as self-reflection and silence and inwardness. Next is a more complicated work, and that is On the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. And the reason why this book is cast into my starter list, if you will, is because Friedrich Nietzsche provides a very cogent criticism of divine or objective morality. And that, paired with his God is Dead claim in The Gay Science, throws society into this moral ambiguity and this chaos. And it's very similar to Dostoevsky's claim that he makes in The Brothers Karamazov as well, where he has this idea of if God is dead or if God doesn't exist, everything is permitted. How can we say that there is right and wrong, good and evil, if there is no God or divine morality? Imagine the enemy as the man of resentment conceives him, and it is here exactly that we see his work, his creativeness. He has conceived the evil enemy, the evil one, and indeed, that is the inspiration from which he now concocts as a counterpart the good one, himself, his very self. And building upon that, in the third essay within this book, Nietzsche also castigates this idea of asceticism and the repression of individuality, or the repression of instincts and power, and instead advocates for the individual to enact his power, enact his will, his drives, and seek that personal growth. Nietzsche takes it in a number of directions, so I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. I have videos on multiple of Nietzsche's books on my channel, so if you want to see a deeper look at that, we can look at it there. But overall, these ideas do get Nietzsche thrown into this umbrella term that is existentialism. And that leads us to the fourth book, which is Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. And again, I want to preface this by stating that Nietzsche is not the perfect existentialist by any means. He is not an individualist, and most explicitly, he does not believe in free will, which makes him a complicated figure under this umbrella and makes him a bit of an outcast compared to these other thinkers that we're going to discuss. But with that said, let's talk about some of the ideas within this book. This book includes a whole host of overlapping topics, some of which are also expressed in On the Genealogy of Morals, which is why I like pairing those two books, because I think they kind of complement each other. Specifically, that idea of rejecting absolute truth, rejecting objective morality, and where we go from there. Well, Nietzsche tells us a bit more in Beyond Good and Evil. Specifically, he discusses this concept of empowering the higher men, becoming a self-propelling wheel, destroying the old law tables and creating new ones, creating new values and the sort. Now, again, it's important to express here that the higher men that Nietzsche is talking about is not you and I. It's not us. It's a very, the 1% of 1%, the great men essentially of history is how Nietzsche views it, that are able to enact this this will and actually push towards this elusive Ubermensch. But again, I think that we can kind of extrapolate some of these ideas, especially the ones about promoting individuality, defining ourselves, enacting this sentiment of power and individuality. I think if we extrapolate those, bracket them out of Nietzsche's overarching philosophical picture and depiction, I think we can see why he gets thrown into this umbrella term and also derive some value from his philosophy. The circumstances one would have in part to create, in part to employ, to bring them into existence, the conjectural paths and tests by virtue of which a soul could grow to such height and power it would feel compelled to these tasks, a re-evaluation of values under whose novel pressure and hammer a conscience would be steeled, a heart transformed to brass, so that it might endure the weight of such responsibility. So in Nietzsche's eyes, these great individuals, which will include you and I in this just for sake, are able to make something of ourselves in this world, pursue greatness by enduring the responsibility of it, taking on the weight of it, and by hammer or chisel, build ourselves into something greater. Next is Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And the reason I selected this rather than all of his great novels, which do a phenomenal job at expressing a lot of different themes and ideas of existentialism, the reason I selected this novella is because it's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit easier to get into, and keep in mind this is a starter kit, it is not the end-all be-all, but also it really lays the groundwork for his big novels that came out before them, and I think it's very helpful to read this first and have this kind of context before you read those novels. Now, within this, we have this, scorned, disdainful, wicked man, as he describes himself in the very first sentence, who rejects rationalism. This book was written in response to a work that came out in Dostoevsky's time. That it was this ideology that through the Enlightenment period and through the improvement of science, that we could just figure this out. Why are there criminals? Why do people act irrationally? Well, if they just knew that was acting wrong, if they just could rationally think about things, there would be no more crime. People would act rationally. We could figure out the world and we could reach this utopia. And Dostoevsky simply rejects this. He's very much an early psychologist in this way. He understands man, he understands himself, and he goes, I don't buy that at all. I don't buy into this crystal palace. I believe that man wants to, quote, stick his tongue out at the crystal palace. He'll shake his fist at it. He'll act irrationally. He'll act erratically. Sometimes he wants to feel the pain of the toothache, as he describes in this work. And essentially, he points out that we act irrationally all the time. And that as much as rationalism in science and psychiatry and all of this is extremely helpful and valuable and gets things right maybe 99.9% of the time, there are cases where we just act against reason. We act erratically. We act without any kind of rational base or thinking. And so the man in this underground man kind of rebels against that. And one of my favorite quotes in this, it doesn't fully tie to what we're talking about here, but it just is one of my favorite quotes that I'll share on 123 of this vintage classics edition, is I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea. And I think that's just a beautiful statement of maybe even today's world. Like, the world's going to hell, but I'm gonna have my tea. I'm not gonna stress about it at all. So anyway, without rambling too long, this is a great existentialist work, especially if you want to get into Dostoevsky and get into his novels. Start here. Oh, and one more thing. I'd also be remiss if I didn't state that the back half of Notes from Underground really presents this idea of the hyperconscious man, the man that is very alienated and isolated and feels like an outcast from society. And that idea of alienation is very central to existentialism as well. which we'll get to with a later thinker that we're going to discuss. Next is a very popular work, and that is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And the central question that this novel explores is suicide justified? Is there a reason to kill ourselves? If there is no God, if there is no afterlife, if there is no meaning to all of this around us, should we just kill ourselves? What's the point of living? What's the point of this dread, this suffering, this pain that is the human condition? Why do we do it? And overall, by the end of the story, Camus explains why you shouldn't, why it is not justified. But really, the reason I choose this and why I recommend it to a lot of people is because this is the best book to start with if you're going to read some of Camus' stories. The Stranger, The Plague, these different stories are great, but they're great if you actually understand the philosophy that underlies them. And that is this idea of absurdism that Camus puts forward. He actually rejected the idea of being an existentialist, but he can say what he wants. He's in that camp. He was a very close colleague of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and he fits into that camp no matter what he says. But the idea of absurdism is almost like a different shade of existentialism. It is not this belief that we can create our own value and that is what drives us, but the fact that we kind of embrace that there is no value, that life is absurd, that we pay these taxes and work towards this life and pursue these goals, and they really don't mean anything. We go to the grocery store with this cycle. We wake up at the same time. We do all these different things like they really mean something, like they're really important, but they're really not. Everything is just kind of absurd and ridiculous, and our existence is quite a strange phenomenon. So what Camus kind of puts forward is one of those principles I spoke about earlier of embracing the present moment, having that gratitude, and finding a sense of meaning and pleasure, if there's any to be found, in the pursuit, in the journey. And that's why he really ties it into the myth of Sisyphus, which is a famous Greek story where Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to roll this boulder up a hill, knowing full well it's going to roll back down. He's just going to have to do it for eternity. Yet he keeps doing it, and he kind of finds a distraction from the pain, from the dread, from the suffering, the torment. He kind of finds pleasure in the fact that he has this task that he has to keep doing. And so that's why he ends this book saying, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. It's this very famous quote. And what I take away from that is just to find pleasure in the journey, find pleasure in the pursuit, that this life may not have something greater beyond it, if you believe that or not. And even if that's the case, we have to be grateful for the journey, be grateful for the ride, enjoy it while it's here. And lastly, I was debating on throwing this book in, but I feel like it would be wrong if we didn't talk about Franz Kafka and toss him in there. And the book I'm selecting is The Trial. Now, why The Trial? Why not The Metamorphosis? Why not The Castle? Why not A Hunger Artist? The reason I like The Trial is because it pisses me off. And it pisses me off not in the book, but I feel angry for the main character. Without getting too much into the plot or spoiling anything, you begin the story, and of course you get this Kafka-esque situation. You have these detectives or cops or basically individuals of some sort letting our main character know that he has been charged, but they won't tell him what he's charged with, and he has to show up to this trial. And it's just this endless loop of bureaucratic BS. He has to go through trial after trial. He keeps seeking an answer, and he can never get an answer. And he's told later in the story, even if this trial gets dismissed or he gets through it, there's another one waiting on the other side. And it's just, to me, what it represents is this one infinite bureaucratic maze that we all have to sift through, where if you want to actually get anything done within your government, or you want to call a certain corporation that provides your internet service or something, you have to talk to one person who has to call to the next person. And they basically knock you into submission due to fatigue. They fatigue you to the point of submission, essentially is what happens with a lot of things in life. And then also you have this uncertainty, this anxiety, this dread that exists throughout this whole novel. You're like dying for just a resolution. Like, even if I'm guilty, even if I'm, if I'm acquitted, if I'm guilty, if I'm condemned to death, like, just give me an answer is what this character wants. And again, I won't spoil the ending, but it's perfect Kafka. It's quintessential Kafka, and it's also just a great story to understand that sense of uncertainty and angst that we all can feel within life, and that existentialism attempts to answer or alleviate in some way. So those are the 7 books I'd recommend you start with if you're looking to get into existentialism. But before we go, and before I'm crucified here on BookTube, we have to talk about Simone de Beauvoir, who was a prominent, essential figure within existentialism, specifically French existentialism, as she worked very closely with Jean-Paul Sartre throughout both their careers. And her work, The Second Sex, was a monumental work because, yes, she wrote a ton about those same kind of universally applied concepts of individuality, self expression, breaking out of these kind of societal constructs or these kind of predetermined forces that are upon us, and defining yourself, right? Making something of yourself in the world. But who has been held down the most throughout history? It's been women. And women have faced these different demands, expectations, constructs, laws, you name it. They have been their self expression, their individuality has been nailed down. It has been held back for so long, and so her work, The Second Sex, and her work overall, really spearheaded the second wave of feminism, as far as I know. So that's why she is a pivotal figure, because her work not only spoke to existentialism universally, but particularly the female experience, the experience and existence of women within society. And to reiterate, there are plenty of other books and writers that I did not discuss in this video, but that's because this is just a leaping point. It's just a starter kit of books that I would recommend you start with. In summary, existentialism is an attempt to provide a solution, or at least an alternative path away from nihilism, where we were once faced with 2 paths in life: either to submit all meaning to God or some kind of divinity or religion, or to accept the fact that there is no meaning, it is all void, and we are just faced with oblivion. Existentialism illuminates a third path where we can discover and create our own meaning. It's an exploration of human experiences, an attempt to understand what they mean and figure out where we go from here. And that's why I think existentialism is possibly the solution to the aimless and decadent society that we have today, where there is complete moral decay and constant mental crises and just this unnerving anxiety that just seems to coat everything. This malaise that is within our youth, it's within our workers, it's within every country in the world, and we can't seem to get out of it. And I think existentialism doesn't have all the answers. It doesn't fit everybody, but I think some of these ideas, these writings, these short stories, these novels, these treaties, they at a bare minimum speak to the reader, and they tell the reader that, hey, you're not alone in feeling isolated and alienated and outcast from the world. You're not alone in feeling this empty pit in your gut when you think about the idea of dying for all eternity and there being nothing left. You're not alone in that uncomfortable dread that we see written about for millennium. And specifically, I think about Pascal's work in Ponces, where he discusses this. But you're not alone. And so it allows the reader, the people today, to resonate with the fact that all of mankind shares in this idea. It allows them to kind of find some sympathy within the writing, and also promote a more positive and productive view of the world rather than falling into pessimism, nihilism, moral decay. Everything is permitted. Who cares? There is no God. It kind of grounds us a little bit. It puts more responsibility, whether you believe in free will or not. It at least provides the optimism that we do have some amount of ownership and autonomy of our life, that we can actually change our life for the better. And I just think that would, I think the world would be a better place if we lived with a little bit more of that perspective and these ideas. So what do you guys think? Do you think existentialism is helpful? Do you think it's a solution to nihilism and the moral decay that we have today, the aimlessness? Or do you think something else? What writers, what books would you recommend? What are some of your favorites? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.